3 people were already dead. The ship was still at sea, and the passengers had no idea where they were going to be allowed to land. 147 people trapped on a vessel somewhere in the Atlantic, a virus with no cure spreading through the crew quarters, and 6 governments scrambling military aircraft to intercept them before they touched civilian ground. The port workers in Tenerife walked out in protest. The island's own leader said, "Do not bring that ship here." So who overruled him? And what does it mean for everyone who lives on that island? That is the question this entire story hinges on. And by the end of this video, you will have your answer. What you are watching unfold right now off the coast of Spain is not just a cruise ship emergency. It is a live test of whether the world's global health infrastructure actually works. And the early signs are not encouraging. In this video, we are going to break down exactly what happened aboard the MV Hondius, from the moment it left Argentina to the moment armed Guardia Civil officers lined up on the dock in Tenerife to manage the disembarkation. We will show you the real timeline, the 3 deaths, and the growing number of passengers evacuated mid-voyage. We are going to reveal who made the critical decision to allow this ship to dock on a Spanish island whose own government said no, and what that decision tells us about the power structure behind international disease response. And we will get into the part that almost no outlet is asking about: why American passengers are being sent to a biocontainment facility in Nebraska when official bodies are calling this a low-risk situation. Those 2 facts cannot both be true. We are going to tell you which one is closer to the truth. We cover stories like this before anyone else. Subscribe right now and hit the bell icon so you never miss a breaking update. The story is moving fast, and the next development could come within hours. Let us start from the beginning. The MV Hondius is not a typical cruise ship. It is an expedition vessel, purpose-built for polar voyages, carrying small groups of adventure travelers to places like Antarctica and the remote sub-Antarctic islands. On its most recent voyage, it departed from Argentina last month with 147 passengers on board. At some point during that journey, people started getting sick. The exact timeline of the first infection is not yet publicly confirmed, but what we know is that by the time the WHO was formally notified, that date was May 2nd, multiple people were already ill, and the situation was serious enough to trigger an international alert. 3 passengers died. Their deaths have been directly linked to hantavirus. Additional passengers were medically evacuated from the ship while it was still at sea, removed by other vessels or aircraft while the Hondius continued its transit toward Europe. By May 10th, the ship was approaching the Port of Granadilla in Tenerife, one of the Canary Islands, which sits off the northwest coast of Africa and is a territory of Spain. The plan? Bring passengers ashore in groups of no more than 10 at a time, sorted by nationality, and immediately fly them to their respective countries under government-managed quarantine protocols. Spain's Guardia Civil, the national military police, was deployed to the port. Armed officers stood watch at the dock. The optics told a story that the official statements were carefully avoiding. This was not a routine disembarkation. This was a controlled extraction. To understand why this outbreak is so alarming, you have to understand what hantavirus actually is and why finding it on a ship is so medically strange. Hantavirus is a family of viruses carried primarily by rodents. Infected animals shed the virus in their urine, feces, and saliva. Humans typically become infected by breathing in airborne particles contaminated with those materials, what scientists call aerosolized excreta. It does not spread through casual human contact. You cannot catch it by shaking hands or sharing a meal. This is what makes its presence on a cruise ship so baffling. The most severe form of hantavirus infection is hantavirus pulmonary syndrome, or HPS. It begins like a flu, fatigue, fever, muscle aches, and then, in severe cases, the lungs begin to fill with fluid. The mortality rate for HPS historically runs between 35% and 40%. There is no approved vaccine. There is no specific antiviral cure. The first major Western outbreak of HPS was in 1993 in the Four Corners region of the United States: New Mexico, Arizona, Colorado, Utah. It killed more than a dozen people and sent shockwaves through the public health world. Scientists eventually traced it to an explosion in deer mouse populations following a period of unusual rainfall that increased vegetation and food supply. In South America, hantavirus strains have been documented for decades, primarily in rural agricultural areas of Argentina, Chile, and Brazil. The Andes strain, which is found in Patagonia, is the one exception to the person-to-person transmission rule. There is evidence the Andes strain can, in rare cases, spread from human to human. That fact sits uncomfortably at the center of this story. The MV Hondius departed from Argentina. It traveled through subantarctic waters. If any rodents boarded that vessel in port, or if the Andes strain entered the passenger population through a single human-to-human transmission event, then everything changes. Not just for the people on board, but for the protocols the world is using to contain this right now. Before we get to the global response and who made the decisions that put 147 people in those small boats, here is what we already know about the hidden angle in this story. And it is more disturbing than anything in the official briefings. There are several institutions and individuals whose decisions in the past 10 days will define how this story ends. Start with Ocean-Wide Expeditions, the Dutch tour operator that owns and operates the MV Hondius. They are the company that ran this voyage, and it is their responsibility to understand the health risks of operating in remote regions of South America where hantavirus is endemic. How those initial cases were handled internally, whether passengers were isolated quickly, whether the crew understood what they were dealing with, how soon the first case was reported to health authorities. These are questions that have not yet been fully answered publicly. Then there is Spain's central government. Health Minister Mónica Garcia approved the docking and announced the quarantine protocols for Spanish nationals, a 14-day stay in a military hospital, individual rooms, no visitors, multiple PCR tests. Her government overruled the concerns of the regional administration. Fernando Clavijo is the president of the Canary Islands government. He opposed the ship docking there. He said so publicly earlier in the week, and his objection was overruled by central government authorities in Madrid. In a territory that depends almost entirely on tourism for its economic survival, the optics of a hantavirus ship pulling into your main port are devastating. His opposition was both a public health position and an economic one. The World Health Organization was notified on May 2nd. It classified the situation as a low risk to the general public. That assessment has remained unchanged, even as military aircraft are being scrambled and passengers are being sent to a biocontainment unit. The United States CDC is managing the evacuation of 17 American passengers, none of whom are currently symptomatic. They will be flown to the University of Nebraska Medical Center, home of the National Quarantine Unit. This is the same federally funded facility that has been used for Ebola patients. That is the company Hantavirus is being placed in, regardless of what the official risk classification says. On the dock at Granadilla Port in Tenerife, the images tell the full story. Members of the Spanish Guardia Civil stood in formation at the reception point, not paramedics, not port health officers, armed military police. Small inflatable transfer boats were ready to ferry passengers from the anchored ship to the dock. No more than 10 people at a time, sorted strictly by nationality to match the waiting repatriation aircraft. Passengers were told to wear FFP2 masks, the European equivalent of an N95. That instruction applied not just to the passengers, but to everyone involved in bus transfers and logistics. Every person who touched this operation was masked and monitored. The luggage was left on the ship. Passengers would not get their personal belongings back until the vessel was fully disinfected in Rotterdam. Think about what it means to arrive in a foreign country, be loaded onto a military transport aircraft, and flown to a quarantine facility without your bags, without your phone chargers, without your medications, without a change of clothes. The Spanish nationals, 14 of them, disembarked first. They were taken to a military hospital. Individual rooms, no visitors. PCR test on arrival. Another PCR 7 days later. The message from Spain's health ministry was clear. We are not taking chances. Port workers had already made their feelings known. Earlier in the week, they held organized protests at the port, demanding clearer communication about the risks they were being asked to take. They were told to show up, to handle the logistics of disembarkation, and to do so at close proximity to passengers from a vessel with a confirmed hantavirus outbreak. The information they received, they said, was insufficient. 147 passengers, 6 nations, armed guards, small boats in the harbor, and a virus with a 35 to 40% fatality rate when it becomes severe. But here's the part that almost no one is talking about. And it does not just change the story. It potentially changes the entire risk calculation that every government involved is using right now. If you are finding this valuable, subscribe right now. Hit the bell. We are about to get into the most important part of this entire story. The international response to this outbreak has been fast, coordinated, and revealing in what it shows about how seriously governments are privately treating a situation they are publicly calling low risk. 6 nations mobilized aircraft for repatriation: the United States, Germany, France, Belgium, Ireland, and the Netherlands. These are not budget charter flights. These are government-organized evacuations with medical oversight. The sequencing of disembarkation was coordinated with the arrival of those aircraft. Passengers were not simply allowed to disperse through commercial airports. They were intercepted, sorted, and channeled into controlled health monitoring pipelines. The U.S. response is the most striking. The CDC confirmed that the 17 American passengers will be transferred to the University of Nebraska Medical Center, home of the National Quarantine Unit. That facility was built specifically for the containment of high-consequence infectious diseases. It was activated during the Ebola crisis in 2014. Placing asymptomatic hantavirus passengers in that unit, even briefly, before transitioning them to home monitoring, signals a level of precautionary severity that the WHO's public statements are not conveying. The WHO's response has been carefully worded. The organization classified the outbreak as low risk to the general public on the basis that hantavirus does not typically spread person to person. That classification is technically accurate for most strains, but it is also a classification that leaves significant uncertainty around the Andes strain in particular, which is the strain circulating in the region where this voyage originated. The European response has been quieter. Germany, France, Belgium, Ireland, and the Netherlands sent aircraft, but have released minimal public information about their monitoring protocols. Whether those nations are sending passengers to equivalent quarantine facilities or simply releasing them to home monitoring immediately is not yet clear from public statements. Spain, navigating a direct conflict between its central government and its regional government, has attempted to project calm authority. The military hospital protocols for Spanish nationals suggest they are treating this more seriously behind closed doors than their public statements indicate. Here is what the official briefings are glossing over. The standard framing for hantavirus outbreaks is this: rodent exposure in rural areas, individual human infection, no human-to-human spread, contained risk. That framing applies to the sin nombre strain found in North America and to most South American strains. The Andes virus is different. The Andes strain is the only known hantavirus strain for which there is documented evidence of direct person-to-person transmission. Researchers studying outbreaks in Patagonia, the very region the MV Hondius was operating near, have identified clusters where the virus moved from one human being to another without any identified rodent intermediate. It is not highly efficient transmission. It is not airborne spread in the way COVID-19 was. But it has happened. It has been documented. And it cannot be ruled out in a closed environment like a ship. Now consider the conditions aboard the MV Hondius. It is an expedition vessel, not a large ocean liner, a compact, purpose-built polar ship. Shared dining areas, shared observation decks, shared briefing rooms where passengers gathered for lectures about the Antarctic wildlife they were seeing. The air recirculation systems on such vessels are not designed for biocontainment. If even one passenger was infected with the Andes strain and transmitted it to another passenger before isolation protocols were in place, the entire risk model changes. And the 42-day monitoring window that U.S. officials announced not the standard 14-day incubation period used for most viral diseases, but 42 days, strongly implies that authorities are factoring in a longer, more uncertain transmission dynamic. The WHO says low risk, the U.S. government says biocontainment facility, and 42 days of monitoring. One of those positions is more honest about what they do not know. We started this video with a question. Who overruled the leader of the Canary Islands and forced that ship to dock? The answer to that question reveals exactly how much of this decision-making has been about public health and how much has been about something else entirely. Subscribe if you have not already, because we are now getting into the stakes and the expert analysis, and the picture that emerges is not a reassuring one. Let us be precise about what is actually at risk here. In the immediate term, the 147 passengers represent a known, manageable cohort. They have been identified, tracked, and are being routed into monitoring systems. If none of them are incubating a symptomatic infection right now, and if the monitoring over the next 6 weeks confirms that, this specific chapter of the outbreak ends cleanly. But clean endings require every variable to go right, and several variables in this situation are not yet under control. The crew of the MV Hondius is continuing aboard the ship to Rotterdam. While crew members have presumably also been screened, they will remain in the vessel's environment for additional days before the ship is disinfected. If any crew member is in the early incubation phase of infection, that extends the exposure window significantly. The port logistics at Tenerife involved local workers, bus drivers, and officials who came into proximity with passengers. Spain's protocols covered the passengers. How thoroughly the Canary Islands' own population is being monitored for secondary exposure is unclear. The worst-case scenario is not catastrophic in the way COVID-19 was. Hantavirus simply does not spread efficiently enough for a global pandemic. But a cluster of cases emerging from this operation, particularly if they involve human-to-human transmission of the Andes strain, would represent a landmark public health event. It would force a complete re-examination of how remote expedition voyages are regulated, how maritime disease protocols operate, and how truthfully governments communicate outbreak risk to their own populations. The best case is that all 147 passengers complete their monitoring periods without incident. The crew disembarks cleanly in Rotterdam, and the ship is disinfected. The outbreak remains contained to the original cases that occurred during the Antarctic voyage. The most likely case sits between those two poles. Some passengers will likely develop symptoms during the monitoring period. The 42-day window is long enough for late-presenting infections. How many and how severe will determine whether this becomes a footnote or a chapter in the public health record. There is also the economic dimension. Tenerife depends on tourism. The images of armed military police at its port managing the disembarkation of a disease-stricken vessel will circulate globally. The Canary Islands leader, Fernando Clavijo, knew exactly what he was looking at when he said, "Do not dock that ship here." His concern was overruled. The footage exists. The consequences for the island's reputation will outlast the outbreak itself. Public health specialists who study hantavirus have been careful but pointed in their public statements since this outbreak began. The critical scientific question they are focused on is strain identification. Until the specific hantavirus strain infecting the passengers is conclusively identified and publicly confirmed, all risk assessments are provisional. The difference between a strain with no human-to-human transmission history and the Andes strain is not a minor distinction. It is the difference between a contained exposure event and a potential cluster with secondary cases in multiple countries simultaneously. Infectious disease epidemiologists have noted that the 42-day monitoring period is significantly longer than the standard maximum incubation period cited for most hantavirus strains, which typically ranges from 1 to 8 weeks, with most cases presenting in 2 to 4 weeks. The decision to extend monitoring to the outer boundary of that range suggests that health authorities are treating this as a precautionary maximum, not a routine procedure. Maritime health law experts have pointed out that the tension between the Canary Islands regional government and Spain's central government is not simply a political disagreement. Under international maritime law, vessels with disease outbreaks are subject to complex negotiations between flag states, port states, and transit states. Spain's central government has authority to override regional objections, but doing so without adequate consultation or communication with local health and labor authorities creates exactly the kind of breakdown that led to the port worker protests. Virologists familiar with South American hantavirus ecology have also flagged the climate connection. Argentina and Chile have experienced above normal precipitation in recent years, linked in part to El Niño and La Niña cycles. Increased rainfall leads to increased vegetation, which leads to increased rodent populations, which leads to more environmental contamination with hantavirus. The spike in cases across Argentina this year is not coincidental. It is a predictable consequence of a changing climate, creating more favorable conditions for rodent population booms. The MV Hondius was operating in exactly the kind of remote, ecologically dynamic environment where those risks are highest. Remember the question we opened this video with? Who overruled Fernando Clavijo and forced that ship into Tenerife? The answer is Spain's central government, acting under international maritime health obligations, coordinating with the WHO, and making the calculation that managing disembarkation from a controlled port was safer than the alternatives. But here is what that decision reveals. No port anywhere in the world had the infrastructure to say yes to this ship with full confidence. Tenerife was chosen because it had the logistics, not because anyone was certain it was safe. 3 scenarios are now in play. Best case, strain confirmation reveals a non-transmissible variant. All 147 passengers complete their monitoring periods without developing symptoms. The crew disembarks cleanly in Rotterdam. The ship is disinfected and returned to service. Public health authorities use this event to strengthen maritime outbreak protocols, improve communication between operators and health agencies, and establish clearer guidelines for polar expedition vessels. The story becomes a drill that worked. Likely case: several passengers develop symptoms during the monitoring window. All are managed within existing quarantine infrastructure and recover. No secondary cases emerge from the port logistics at Tenerife or from community exposure in any of the 6 repatriation countries. However, investigators confirmed that the voyage involved lax rodent control protocols aboard the ship, and ocean-wide expeditions faces significant regulatory and legal scrutiny. International maritime health bodies convene an emergency review of polar expedition vessel standards. Hantavirus moves from an obscure rural disease to a headline public health concern. Worst case, strain confirmation reveals Andes virus with documented person-to-person transmission events during the voyage. Secondary cases emerge in multiple countries. Some involve individuals with no documented ship exposure, indicating that the transmission chain extended beyond the vessel. The 42-day monitoring window proves insufficient for some edge cases. This does not become a COVID-scale pandemic. The virus is not that efficient. But it becomes a serious multi-country cluster, a political crisis for the governments that manage the repatriation, and a landmark case that fundamentally changes how the world regulates adventure cruise operations in endemic regions. The intelligence agencies, the CDC, and the WHO all have access to the strain data right now. What they tell the public in the next week will reveal which scenario they believe is most likely. Before we close this out, we want to hear from you directly. Here is the first question. Given that the WHO classified this as a low-risk situation, while the United States simultaneously sent passengers to a biocontainment unit with a 42-day monitoring requirement, which of those 2 positions do you think is actually telling the truth? Leave your answer below. This is a real debate happening among epidemiologists right now, and your instinct matters. Second question. Fernando Clavijo, the leader of the Canary Islands, publicly opposed this ship docking and was overruled by Spain's central government. Was that the right call? Should central governments have the power to force local communities to absorb the risk of disease management operations? Or should regional governments have veto power over their own ports? These are not rhetorical questions. They go to the heart of how global health governance actually works, who bears the risk, and whether the current system is built to protect people or just to manage optics. Tell us what you think. This community produces the best comment sections in news analysis, and this story deserves a serious conversation. Let us bring this together. 3 takeaways from everything we have covered today. First, the official risk classification of low risk does not match the operational response. Biocontainment units, military aircraft evacuations, armed police at the dock, and 42-day monitoring windows are not the tools you deploy for a low-risk situation. There is a gap between what is being said publicly and what is being done privately, and that gap is the real story. Second, the Andes strain's capacity for person-to-person transmission is the scientific variable that every risk calculation in this event depends on. Until that strain is confirmed and publicly disclosed, every government's monitoring protocol is essentially a hedge against a possibility that no one is officially admitting out loud. Third, this outbreak did not come from nowhere. It came from a world with a warmer, wetter climate, producing larger rodent populations, combined with a global adventure tourism industry operating in increasingly remote ecosystems, with protocols that were designed for a different era. This is not the last time something like this will happen. Watch what gets announced about the strain identification in the next 72 hours. Watch whether any of the repatriated passengers develop symptoms during their monitoring period. And watch whether ocean-wide expeditions faces accountability or whether the entire regulatory conversation gets quietly shelved once the headlines move on. This story is not over. What happens in the next few weeks could redefine how the world thinks about biosecurity at sea. Subscribe and hit the bell icon right now, because when the next development breaks, we will be the first to cover it, and you will want to be here for it. Here is your final thought to carry with you. In a world where humans travel farther, faster, and into more remote ecosystems than at any point in history, the question is no longer whether a virus from a distant corner of the world will find its way onto a ship. The question is whether the systems we built to stop it are honest enough to admit when they don't know the answer.